Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the cobblestone streets of Kilkenny, Ireland, in the year 1324, where the scent of wood smoke mingles with something far more sinister, the acrid smell of fear and suspicion that's about to ignite Europe's first documented witch trial. You're walking through a world where the line between the natural and supernatural is as thin as parchment, where a woman's success can be her death sentence, and where one merchant's defiance will literally rewrite the rules of European justice. You probably won't survive what's coming if you're Dame Alice Keitler, but lucky for you, you're just an observer in this medieval nightmare that's about to unfold. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing our little community span the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a prosperous Anglo-Norman town where stone houses rise above timber-framed cottages, their glass windows, a luxury most Europeans can't imagine, catching the last rays of autumn sunlight. Kilkenny, in 1324, isn't just any medieval backwater. It's a thriving commercial hub where English law meets Irish tradition, creating exactly the kind of cultural friction that breeds suspicion. The air carries the sounds of merchants hawking their wares, the clatter of horseshoes on stone, and underneath it, all whispered conversations that stop abruptly when certain names are mentioned. Dame Alice Keitler's house dominates the merchant quarter, its imposing facade speaking of wealth that makes neighbors uncomfortable. You can see why, in an age where most people struggle to survive, Alice has accumulated riches that would make kings envious. But wealth in medieval times isn't just about money. It's about power, influence, and the dangerous attention that comes with both. The Norman Irish elite, who control Kilkenny's trade routes, have watched Alice's rise with growing unease, especially since she's managed to outlive 4 husbands, while somehow growing richer with each funeral. The political landscape you're navigating is treacherous. Ireland, in 1324, exists in a constant state of tension between the Anglo-Norman colonizers, who have controlled the island for over a century, and the native Irish population, who have never fully accepted their rule. Add to this mix the growing influence of the Catholic Church, armed with new papal decrees about heresy and magic, and you have a powder keg waiting for someone like Alice to light the fuse. The fact that she's managed to thrive in this environment for decades only adds to the mystery surrounding her success. As you walk through Kilkenny's narrow streets, you notice how conversations change when Alice's name comes up. Some speak of her with grudging respect. She's, after all, one of the most successful merchants in Ireland. Others lower their voices and make the sign of the cross, whispering about her late husband's strange illness and the unusual circumstances surrounding his death. The town's women seem particularly divided. Some admire her independence in a world where women rarely control their own destinies, while others view her success as unnatural, possibly unholy. The religious atmosphere adds another layer of tension to your medieval surroundings. The new Franciscan bishop, Richard de Ledred, has arrived from England with reformist zeal and a mandate to root out heresy wherever he finds it. His sermons ring from the cathedral steps, warning about the dangers of consorting with demons and the necessity of purifying the faith. You can feel the change in the air, the easy tolerance of folk practices and local customs that characterized earlier decades is giving way to something harder, more suspicious, more dangerous. What makes Alice's situation particularly precarious is timing. You're witnessing a moment when medieval society is beginning to codify its fears about witchcraft into legal proceedings. The Inquisition has been refining its techniques for decades, but Ireland has remained largely untouched by systematic witch hunting. That's about to change, and Alice Keitler, whether she knows it or not, is about to become the unfortunate pioneer in a legal revolution that will claim tens of thousands of lives across Europe over the coming centuries. The irony isn't lost on you that this first great witch trial emerges not from some backwater village ruled by superstition, but from one of Ireland's most cosmopolitan towns, where education and commerce should theoretically provide protection against such accusations. Instead, you're about to witness how political ambition, religious fervor, and social jealousy can combine to create a perfect storm of persecution that will echo through European history for centuries to come. You're examining the ledgers and properties that make Dame Alice Keitler the most successful and most suspicious woman in Ireland. Her wealth isn't just impressive, it's historically unprecedented for a woman of her time. And in 1324, unprecedented wealth raises uncomfortable questions about its source. As you trace her financial empire, you begin to understand why her neighbors whisper about supernatural assistance. Because honestly, her business acumen seems almost magical in an age when most merchants struggle to maintain a single profitable venture. Alice's first husband, William Outlaw, left her a comfortable inheritance when he died, but that was just the beginning. Her second marriage to Adam LeBlond of Callan brought her deeper into the Anglo-Norman trading networks that controlled Ireland's commerce. When Adam died, under circumstances that raised eyebrows, even then, Alice inherited his substantial holdings and immediately began expanding them in ways that defied conventional medieval business practices. She diversified her investments across multiple sectors, from wool trading to money lending, creating a financial empire that would be impressive even by modern standards. The death of her third husband, Richard de Val, marked the point where whispers became accusations. Richard had been wealthy in his own right, but during their marriage, he'd grown inexplicably ill, becoming increasingly dependent on Alice's care, while his fortune mysteriously flowed into her coffers. Witnesses later claimed they'd seen Alice administering strange potions to Richard, concoctions that seemed to worsen his condition rather than improve it. The medieval mind, always quick to attribute unusual events to supernatural causes, began connecting dots that painted a sinister picture of Alice's domestic arrangements. But it's her fourth husband, Sir John Lepoer, whose illness and death finally triggers the investigation that threatens to destroy her. Sir John, a member of one of Ireland's most powerful Anglo-Norman families, had been robust and healthy when he married Alice. Within months, he'd become a shadow of his former self, suffering from symptoms that medieval physicians couldn't explain or treat. His relatives watched in horror as he grew weaker, while Alice grew correspondingly stronger, both financially and politically. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, even for those who'd previously dismissed the rumors as jealous gossip. What particularly troubles Sir John's family is how Alice has positioned herself to inherit not just his wealth, but his political connections and social standing. In medieval society, such calculated maneuvering by a woman suggests either exceptional intelligence or supernatural assistance, and the Lepoers are inclined to believe the latter. They've commissioned their own investigation into Alice's activities, hiring informants and gathering testimony that paints a picture of a woman who uses more than conventional business acumen to achieve her goals. The evidence they've compiled reads like a catalog of medieval anxieties about successful women. Alice allegedly maintains a private chapel where she conducts rituals that bear no resemblance to Christian worship. Servants report finding strange powders and potions in her chambers, substances that emit unusual odors and produce unsettling effects on those who handle them. Most damning of all are the testimonies about Alice's nocturnal activities. Witnesses claim to have seen her consorting with a mysterious figure they describe as her familiar spirit, a being who appears sometimes as a man, sometimes as a beast, and always under cover of darkness. Historians still argue whether Alice was genuinely involved in magical practices, or whether she was simply a brilliant businesswoman whose success threatened powerful men who couldn't accept being outmaneuvered by a woman. The answer probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Alice may have engaged in folk practices that could be interpreted as magical, while also possessing the kind of strategic intelligence that allowed her to navigate medieval Ireland's complex political and economic landscape more successfully than most men of her era. What's undeniable is that Alice has accumulated wealth and influence that makes her a target for enemies who understand that the surest way to destroy a successful woman in medieval times is to question the source of her success. By 1324, those enemies have found their weapon in the form of Bishop Richard de Ledred, a man whose theological training has convinced him that Alice's prosperity must be demonic in origin. The convergence of these forces, Alice's undeniable success, her enemy's determination to destroy her, and a bishop's zealous commitment to rooting out heresy, creates the perfect conditions for Europe's first systematic witch trial. The tragedy is that Alice's intelligence and business acumen, qualities that might have been celebrated in a man, become evidence of supernatural corruption when found in a woman. You're witnessing the moment when medieval society's discomfort with successful women crystallizes into legal persecution, setting a precedent that will haunt European women for centuries to come. You're standing beside Bishop Richard de Ledred as he prepares to wage what he sees as holy war against the forces of darkness that have infiltrated his diocese. This Franciscan friar, recently appointed to the Irish See of Ossory, brings with him all the reformist zeal of his order, and a conviction that Alice Keitler represents everything wrong with the lax spiritual oversight that has characterized Ireland's relationship with Rome. In his mind, Alice isn't just a successful merchant who might have engaged in questionable practices. She's the visible tip of a heretical iceberg that threatens the very foundations of Christian civilization. Ledred's background shapes his approach to Alice's case in ways that will reverberate through European legal history. Born in England and educated in continental monasteries, he's been exposed to the latest developments in canon law and inquisitorial procedure. Unlike his Irish predecessors, who often turned a blind eye to local customs that didn't quite align with Orthodox Christianity, Ledred sees such tolerance as dangerous compromise with evil. He's arrived in Kilkenny armed with papal bulls that specifically address the prosecution of heretics and magicians, legal weapons that have never been seriously deployed in Ireland. The timing of Ledred's arrival couldn't be more significant for what's about to unfold. Pope John XXII has recently issued a series of decrees that specifically address the growing problem of magical practices throughout Christendom. These papal pronouncements don't just condemn magic as sinful, they classify it as heresy, placing it in the same category as denial of basic Christian doctrine. This legal reclassification gives bishops like Ledred unprecedented authority to investigate and prosecute cases that previous generations of churchmen might have handled through simple penance or excommunication. What makes Ledred particularly dangerous to Alice is his understanding of how political power works in medieval Ireland. He recognizes that the Anglo-Norman elite who control Kilkenny's wealth and influence have been protecting Alice because she's useful to them. Her financial network serves their interests, and her success reflects well on their community's prosperity. But Ledred also understands that this protection has limits, and he's prepared to exploit every weakness in their support to achieve his goals. His strategy involves isolating Alice from her protectors by demonstrating that association with her carries unacceptable spiritual and political risks. The bishop's investigation methods reflect the latest developments in inquisitorial technique, procedures that will become standard throughout Europe, but are being applied in Ireland for the first time. Rather than simply accepting accusations and counter-accusations, Ledred systematically gathers testimony, cross-references claims, and builds a legal case that can withstand scrutiny from both ecclesiastical and secular authorities. He's particularly skilled at identifying witnesses whose testimony can be portrayed as credible, focusing on servants and social inferiors who have less to lose by cooperating with church authorities. Ledred's theological training also influences how he interprets the evidence against Alice. Where others might see a shrewd businesswoman who successfully navigated Ireland's complex political landscape, he sees clear signs of demonic assistance. Alice's unusual prosperity, her success in maintaining influence through 4 marriages, and her ability to outlive multiple husbands all fit patterns that his theological education has taught him to recognize as indicators of supernatural corruption. From his perspective, Alice's case isn't just about one woman's alleged crimes. It's about defending Christian civilization against forces that threaten its very foundation. The bishop's correspondence with other church officials reveals his awareness that Alice's case will set important precedents for how similar situations are handled throughout Europe. He's not just prosecuting a local heretic, he's establishing procedures and legal principles that will guide future witch trials across the continent. This consciousness of his historical role drives him to be particularly thorough in his documentation, creating records that will serve as templates for later inquisitors. Historians still argue whether Ledred genuinely believed in Alice's guilt, or whether he saw her case primarily as an opportunity to demonstrate the Church's authority in Ireland. But his meticulous approach suggests someone who understands the broader implications of what he's attempting. What makes Ledred's crusade particularly effective is his ability to frame Alice's prosecution in terms that appeal to different constituencies. To his ecclesiastical superiors, he presents her case as a necessary defense of Orthodox Christianity against heretical corruption. To the Anglo-Norman elite, he emphasizes the political dangers of allowing challenges to established authority to go unpunished. To the common people of Kilkenny, he speaks of protecting the community from spiritual contamination that threatens their salvation. This multi-layered approach ensures that Alice faces opposition from multiple directions simultaneously, making it almost impossible for her to mount an effective defense. The bishop's determination to pursue Alice regardless of her political connections or social standing marks a significant shift in how church authority operates in medieval Ireland. Previous bishops had generally worked within existing power structures, accommodating local customs and influential families rather than challenging them directly. Ledred's willingness to prosecute a woman as powerful as Alice demonstrates that the age of such accommodation is ending, replaced by a more rigorous enforcement of Orthodox Christianity that will tolerate no deviation from approved doctrine and practice. You're in the stone chamber where Petronilla de Meath, Alice Keitler's personal servant, sits chained to a wooden chair, her voice trembling as she delivers testimony that will horrify medieval Europe and establish the template for witch confessions for centuries to come. Petronilla's words, extracted through methods that medieval justice considers perfectly legitimate, paint a picture of domestic life so twisted and supernatural that even hardened church officials find themselves making the sign of the cross as they record her statements. What makes her testimony particularly chilling is its combination of intimate domestic detail and otherworldly horror. She describes Alice's household as a place where the mundane and the demonic intersect in ways that challenge everything medieval Christianity teaches about the natural order. According to Petronilla's confession, Alice's success isn't the result of business acumen or fortunate marriages, but of a carefully maintained relationship with a demonic entity she calls Robin Artisan. This creature, Petronilla claims, appears to Alice in various forms, sometimes as a cat, sometimes as a shaggy dog, and most disturbingly, sometimes as a dark-skinned man who enters Alice's chamber under cover of darkness. The servant describes witnessing intimate encounters between her mistress and this entity, scenes that violate every medieval concept of proper Christian behavior, while explaining Alice's supernatural prosperity in terms that confirm the Church's worst fears about the source of her wealth. The confession details rituals that Petronilla claims to have witnessed or participated in under Alice's direction. She describes nocturnal gatherings where Alice and her associates engaged in practices that parody Christian worship, burning candles made from strange substances, reciting prayers backwards, and offering sacrifices that included both animal and human elements. Most damaging to Alice's case is Petronilla's claim that these rituals were specifically designed to maintain Alice's hold over her husbands and to ensure the transfer of their wealth to her upon their deaths. The servant describes preparing potions and powders under Alice's supervision, substances that were administered to Alice's husbands to keep them compliant, and eventually to hasten their deaths when their usefulness expired. What makes Petronilla's testimony particularly credible to medieval audiences is her detailed knowledge of Alice's domestic arrangements and her ability to describe events that only someone with intimate access to the household could have witnessed. She provides specific information about Alice's private chambers, her hidden stores of magical materials, and her clandestine meetings with associates who shared her heretical beliefs. This level of detail, combined with Petronilla's obvious terror and apparent reluctance to speak, convinces Bishop Ledred and his investigators that they're hearing the truth about practices that have remained hidden for years. The servant's account of Alice's magical practices reveals a sophisticated understanding of folk traditions that the Church has always viewed with suspicion, but has never before prosecuted with such systematic thoroughness. Petronilla describes Alice's use of herbs and minerals to create potions with specific effects, some designed to inspire love or lust, others to cause illness or death, and still others to provide protection from enemies or rivals. She claims Alice maintained detailed records of these recipes and their effects, approaching magic with the same methodical precision she applied to her business dealings. Perhaps most disturbing to medieval sensibilities is Petronilla's description of Alice's attitude toward Christianity. Rather than being a secret pagan or outright heretic, Alice apparently viewed Christian practices as simply another form of magic to be manipulated for personal gain. According to her servant, Alice attended church regularly and maintained the outward appearance of piety while privately mocking Christian teachings and boasting about her ability to deceive priests and bishops. This calculated blasphemy strikes at the heart of medieval religious authority, suggesting that even apparently devout Christians might be secret enemies of the faith. The confession also reveals the social dynamics that enabled Alice's activities to continue undetected for so long. Petronilla describes a network of servants, associates, and accomplices who were bound to Alice through a combination of fear, financial dependence, and shared guilt. Some were willing participants in her rituals, while others were coerced through threats or magical compulsion. This testimony provides Bishop Ledred with a roadmap for expanding his investigation beyond Alice herself to include a broader conspiracy of heretics and devil worshippers who have been operating under the noses of Kilkenny's Christian community. Historians still argue whether Petronilla's confession represents genuine revelation of hidden practices or the product of interrogation techniques designed to extract the kind of testimony that church authorities expected to hear. Medieval justice assumed that physical and psychological pressure was necessary to overcome the natural reluctance of criminals to confess their crimes, and Petronilla's evident distress could be interpreted as either genuine remorse or the result of coercive questioning. What's clear is that her testimony provides exactly the kind of detailed, first-hand account that medieval legal procedures required to justify prosecution for heresy and witchcraft. The servant's words echo through the stone chamber with a weight that transcends their immediate legal significance. You're hearing the birth of a narrative template that will be repeated in witch trials across Europe for the next 3 centuries. Detailed confessions of demonic pacts, supernatural abilities, and secret conspiracies against Christian civilization. Petronilla de Meath, whether willingly or under duress, has just provided the script that will justify the execution of tens of thousands of accused witches throughout the medieval and early modern periods. You're navigating the treacherous political landscape of medieval Ireland, where Alice Keitler's trial has become a proxy war between competing power structures that extend far beyond one woman's alleged crimes. The case has attracted the attention of every major political player in the region, from local Anglo-Norman lords to English administrators in Dublin, and even the papal court in Avignon. What started as a religious prosecution has evolved into a complex political chess game where Alice's fate depends as much on diplomatic maneuvering as on the evidence presented against her. The Anglo-Norman elite of Kilkenny find themselves in an impossible position. Alice's financial network has been integral to their prosperity. She's funded their ventures, facilitated their trade relationships, and provided the kind of sophisticated financial services that medieval Ireland desperately needs. Many of these men owe their current wealth to Alice's assistance, and her destruction would create a financial crisis that could devastate the entire Anglo-Norman community in the region. Yet supporting a woman accused of heresy and witchcraft carries its own risks, potentially bringing down the wrath of both church and crown on anyone who appears to be protecting demonic influences. Arnold Lepoer, Alice's stepson, and one of the most powerful men in Ireland, emerges as her most significant protector. As Seneschal of Kilkenny, he possesses both the authority and the motivation to shield Alice from prosecution. Her conviction would not only destroy a valuable ally, but would also validate accusations that his own family has been compromised by demonic influences. Lepoer's position allows him to obstruct Bishop Ledred's investigation in subtle but effective ways, delaying arrests, limiting access to witnesses, and generally making it clear that the Church's authority in secular matters is subject to civil oversight. The conflict between Lepoer and Bishop Ledred quickly escalates beyond Alice's case to become a fundamental dispute about the balance of power between church and state in medieval Ireland. Ledred asserts that heresy cases fall under ecclesiastical jurisdiction, and that secular authorities have no right to interfere with church investigations. Lepoer counters that Alice's political connections and economic importance make her case a matter of state security that requires careful handling by civil authorities. This jurisdictional dispute reflects broader tensions throughout medieval Europe about the proper relationship between religious and secular power. The English administration in Dublin watches these developments with growing concern. Ireland's colonial government depends on the cooperation of Anglo-Norman lords like Lepoer to maintain control over the island. But it also cannot afford to appear to be protecting heretics from legitimate church prosecution. The case presents English officials with a dilemma that has no easy solution. Supporting Lepoer risks conflict with Rome and potentially with the English church hierarchy, while abandoning Alice could destabilize the political alliances that keep Ireland under English control. Adding another layer of complexity to the political situation is the response of the native Irish population to Alice's trial. Many Irish observers see the conflict between Alice and Bishop Ledred as an internal dispute among their Anglo-Norman oppressors, an opportunity for these colonizers to destroy each other rather than focusing their attention on subjugating the indigenous population. Some Irish leaders quietly encourage the prosecution, hoping that the destruction of Alice's financial network will weaken Anglo-Norman economic dominance. Others worry that successful prosecution of Alice will establish precedents for church persecution that could eventually be turned against Irish traditional practices. The papal court's interest in Alice's case reflects broader concerns about maintaining church authority throughout Christendom. Pope John XXII has been waging his own political battles with secular rulers who challenge ecclesiastical jurisdiction, and Alice's case offers an opportunity to demonstrate that church law supersedes secular considerations, even in distant corners of the Christian world. Papal support for Bishop Ledred's prosecution sends a clear message to political leaders throughout Europe that protecting heretics will not be tolerated, regardless of their political or economic value. What makes the political maneuvering around Alice's case particularly complex is the way it intersects with personal relationships and family loyalties that cross religious and secular boundaries. Many of the men involved in the case are connected through marriage, business partnerships, or feudal obligations that create conflicting loyalties. Arnold Lepore, for example, must balance his role as Alice's protector with his relationships with other Anglo-Norman families who view her as a threat to their own interests. Bishop Ledred must consider how his prosecution of Alice affects his relationships with the powerful families whose support he needs to govern his diocese effectively. The economic dimensions of the political conflict cannot be ignored. Alice's destruction would create opportunities for rivals to acquire her properties and business relationships, providing financial incentives for some of her apparent supporters to abandon her when the political winds shift. The promise of confiscated wealth has always been a powerful motivator in heresy prosecutions, and Alice's substantial holdings make her case particularly attractive to those who might profit from her downfall. Historians still argue whether the political maneuvering around Alice's case represents genuine concern about her alleged crimes or opportunistic exploitation of religious accusations to settle secular scores. The evidence suggests elements of both. Some participants seem genuinely convinced of Alice's guilt, while others appear to be using the prosecution to advance their own political or economic interests. What's clear is that Alice's fate will be determined as much by political calculation as by legal evidence, setting a precedent for how witch trials throughout Europe will be influenced by factors that have little to do with actual guilt or innocence. As you observe these political machinations unfolding, you begin to understand that Alice Keitler's trial represents more than just the prosecution of one woman for alleged magical practices. It's become a test case for fundamental questions about authority, jurisdiction, and power that will shape European society for centuries to come. You're examining the bizarre catalog of evidence that Bishop Ledred's investigators have assembled against Alice Keitler, a collection of materials and testimonies that reads like a medieval encyclopedia of fears about female power and supernatural corruption. The physical evidence alone would make modern forensic investigators laugh. But in 1324, these items represent tangible proof of Alice's trafficking with demonic forces. Each piece of evidence builds upon the others to create a narrative of systematic heresy that confirms every medieval anxiety about the dangers of allowing women to operate beyond traditional social constraints. The investigation has uncovered what prosecutors describe as Alice's sorcery chamber, a private room in her house where she allegedly conducted her magical operations. The space contains an altar of sorts, the one that bears no resemblance to Christian worship. Instead of crucifixes and holy relics, investigators find strange symbols carved into the wooden surface, stains that they claim are from blood sacrifices, and residues from burned substances that produce unusual odors when examined. The room's very existence suggests a level of premeditation and systematic practice that elevates Alice's alleged crimes from simple superstition to organized heresy. Perhaps most damning in medieval eyes are the powders and potions found throughout Alice's house. These substances, analyzed by church authorities who claim expertise in such matters, allegedly include ingredients that no Christian woman should possess. One powder, found in Alice's private chambers, is said to contain the crushed bones of unbaptized infants mixed with herbs that bloom only during certain phases of the moon. Another concoction, discovered hidden in her kitchen, reportedly includes the fingernails and hair of her deceased husbands, preserved in a mixture that witnesses claim glows with an unnatural light when exposed to darkness. The testimonies about Alice's supernatural abilities grow more elaborate as the investigation progresses. Witnesses now come forward claiming to have seen her transform into various animal forms: a black cat that prowls the streets of Kilkenny at night, a raven that spies on her enemies from church towers, and most disturbingly, a wolf that has been seen consorting with actual wolves in the forests outside town. These shape-shifting abilities, witnesses claim, allow Alice to gather information about her rivals and to strike at them in ways that leave no trace of human involvement. Several witnesses provide detailed accounts of Alice's alleged flying abilities, descriptions that will become standard elements of witch trial testimony throughout Europe. They claim to have seen her levitating in her chamber while conducting rituals, rising several feet above the ground as she communed with demonic forces. More dramatically, multiple witnesses swear they've observed Alice flying through the night sky, sometimes alone and sometimes accompanied by other women who share her heretical beliefs. These flight narratives tap into deep-seated medieval anxieties about women's mobility and independence, transforming Alice's ability to travel freely through Ireland's political landscape into evidence of supernatural corruption. The investigation has also uncovered what prosecutors describe as Alice's Devil's Cookbook, a collection of recipes and instructions for creating magical effects. This document, written in Alice's own hand according to expert testimony, contains detailed instructions for brewing love potions, death curses, and protective charms. Most shocking to medieval sensibilities are the recipes that allegedly require desecration of Christian symbols, instructions for grinding up consecrated communion wafers to create powders that bind demons to the user's will, or procedures for melting down stolen church silver to create amulets that provide protection from divine justice. The economic evidence against Alice proves equally damning in the context of medieval assumptions about women's capabilities. Investigators have traced financial transactions that seem to demonstrate supernatural assistance in her business dealings. They point to investments that yielded impossible returns, trade ventures that succeeded despite facing insurmountable obstacles, and loan arrangements that somehow always worked in Alice's favor regardless of changing market conditions. In an age when most merchants struggle to maintain modest profits, Alice's consistent success across multiple decades suggests divine favor, or more likely, given the other evidence, demonic assistance. Witnesses now describe Alice's relationship with Robin Artisan in increasingly elaborate detail. They claim this demonic entity appears to her in a luxurious chamber that somehow exists within her normal house, but is larger and more richly appointed than the physical space should allow. In this supernatural room, witnesses report Alice and her demonic consort plan the destruction of her enemies, the acquisition of additional wealth, and the corruption of other women who might be useful to their cause. The entity allegedly provides Alice with detailed information about future events, allowing her to make business decisions and political alliances that seem impossibly prescient to ordinary mortals. The testimony about Alice's magical practices reveals a sophisticated understanding of what medieval authorities consider the most dangerous forms of witchcraft. She's accused of creating wax images of her enemies and subjecting them to various tortures that produce corresponding suffering in the actual persons. Witnesses describe seeing Alice pierce these dolls with needles while chanting incantations in languages that no Christian should know, causing her targets to experience mysterious illnesses that physicians cannot diagnose or treat. This sympathetic magic, they claim, allows Alice to strike at enemies who are physically beyond her reach, making her far more dangerous than any conventional opponent. Historians still argue whether the evidence against Alice represents genuine discovery of magical practices, or the systematic construction of a case designed to justify predetermined conclusions. The physical evidence could be interpreted as the tools of folk healing and traditional practices that many medieval women employed, while the testimonies might reflect the investigators' leading questions and the witnesses' desire to provide the kind of sensational details that authorities clearly wanted to hear. What's undeniable is that the accumulated evidence creates a compelling narrative of supernatural corruption that validates every medieval fear about the dangers of female independence and success. You're watching Alice Keitler execute what may be the most brilliant strategic retreat in medieval legal history, a carefully planned escape that demonstrates the same intelligence and foresight that built her commercial empire. While Bishop Ledred's investigation closes in around her, and her political protectors begin to waver under ecclesiastical pressure, Alice makes the calculated decision that discretion is indeed the better part of valor. Her escape isn't the panicked flight of a guilty woman, but the strategic withdrawal of someone who understands that the political winds have shifted against her, and that staying to fight would be suicide, regardless of her actual innocence or guilt. Alice's preparations for departure reveal the depth of her political connections and the sophistication of her planning. Rather than simply fleeing in terror, she systematically transfers her most valuable assets to secure locations, arranges for the protection of her supporters who cannot accompany her, and establishes communication networks that will allow her to monitor developments in Ireland from a safe distance. These preparations suggest someone who has anticipated this possibility for some time, perhaps recognizing that her success and independence would eventually provoke the kind of reaction that Bishop Ledred represents. The timing of Alice's escape demonstrates her understanding of medieval legal procedures and political realities. She doesn't wait for formal charges to be filed or for arrest warrants to be issued. Instead, she recognizes that Petronilla's confession and the mounting evidence against her have created a situation where legal victory is impossible regardless of the facts. By leaving before the case reaches its formal conclusion, Alice preserves her options and avoids the kind of public humiliation that would destroy her credibility permanently. Her departure also denies Bishop Ledred the satisfaction of a complete victory, leaving questions about her guilt that will never be definitively resolved. Alice's choice of England as her destination reflects both practical considerations and symbolic significance. Practically, England offers her the protection of a legal system that operates independently of Irish ecclesiastical courts, and where her wealth and connections can provide some measure of security. Symbolically, her flight to England represents a rejection of the Anglo-Norman community in Ireland that has failed to protect her adequately. By seeking refuge in the mother country, Alice makes a statement about where her ultimate loyalties lie, and demonstrates that Ireland's colonial elite cannot always count on the support of those they claim to represent. The logistics of Alice's escape reveal the extent of her network and the loyalty she inspires in her supporters. Despite the dangers of being associated with someone accused of heresy and witchcraft, several of her associates risk their own safety to facilitate her departure. Ships are arranged, safe houses are prepared, and communications are established, all the elements of a successful escape plan that requires the cooperation of people who believe in Alice's innocence or who value their relationship with her more than their own security. Alice's ability to maintain her wealth and status after her escape demonstrates the international nature of medieval commercial networks and the limitations of ecclesiastical authority. While Bishop Ledred can can seize her properties in Ireland and excommunicate her from the church. He cannot reach her assets in England or destroy her relationships with merchants and financiers who operate across national boundaries. Alice's escape transforms her from a defendant in a heresy trial into an exile whose continued prosperity outside Ireland implicitly challenges the legitimacy of the charges against her. The political implications of Alice's successful escape reverberate throughout the Anglo-Norman community in Ireland. Her departure demonstrates that even the most powerful and well-connected individuals are not safe from church prosecution. But it also shows that those with sufficient resources and connections can evade ecclesiastical justice if they act quickly and decisively. This precedent creates a dangerous dynamic where the church's authority is simultaneously affirmed and undermined. Affirmed because Alice's flight implicitly acknowledges the legitimacy of the charges against her, but undermined because her successful escape suggests that church justice can be avoided by those with sufficient wealth and political connections. From her safe haven in England, Alice begins what amounts to a medieval public relations campaign designed to rehabilitate her reputation and undermine Bishop Ledred's credibility. She uses her connections with English nobility and church officials to present her case as an example of ecclesiastical overreach and political persecution. Her version of events portrays her not as a heretic fleeing justice, but as a successful businesswoman victimized by a zealous bishop who cannot tolerate female independence and prosperity. This counter-narrative finds receptive audiences among English elites who have their own reasons to be suspicious of Irish ecclesiastical authorities. Alice's exile strategy includes maintaining contact with her supporters in Ireland through a network of intermediaries who risk their own safety to serve as communication channels. These loyal associates provide her with detailed information about developments in her case and allow her to coordinate support for those she has left behind. The existence of this network demonstrates the depth of loyalty Alice inspired and suggests that her influence in Irish affairs continues even after her physical departure from the country. The economic impact of Alice's escape extends far beyond her personal circumstances. Her departure creates a power vacuum in Kilkenny's commercial networks that other merchants and financiers struggle to fill. The disruption to trade relationships and financial arrangements that Alice had carefully constructed over decades creates opportunities for some and disasters for others. Her escape also demonstrates the fragility of commercial networks that depend heavily on individual relationships and personal trust. Alice's departure unravels business arrangements that had seemed stable and permanent. Perhaps most significantly, Alice's successful escape establishes a precedent that will influence how future witch trial defendants approach their legal situations. Her example demonstrates that flight can be a viable alternative to fighting charges in court, particularly for those with sufficient resources to establish new lives elsewhere. This precedent will encourage other accused witches throughout Europe to attempt similar escapes, though few will have Alice's advantages of wealth, connections, and advance warning of impending prosecution. The symbolic significance of Alice's escape resonates throughout medieval societies' understanding of justice and authority. Her ability to evade punishment challenges fundamental assumptions about the inevitability of divine justice and the effectiveness of ecclesiastical authority. If Alice is genuinely guilty of the crimes alleged against her, her escape suggests that evil can triumph over good through cunning and resources. If she is innocent, her flight demonstrates that the Church's justice system can be corrupted by political considerations and personal animosity. Either interpretation undermines confidence in the institutions that medieval society depends upon for moral and social order. Alice's life in English exile becomes a subject of intense speculation and rumor that adds to her legend throughout Ireland and beyond. Reports filter back about her continued prosperity, her maintenance of a luxurious household, and her apparent immunity from divine punishment for her alleged crimes. These stories serve different purposes for different audiences. Her supporters see them as evidence of her innocence, while her enemies interpret them as proof of her continued trafficking with demonic forces. The ambiguity surrounding Alice's post-escape life ensures that her case remains controversial and influential long after the immediate crisis has passed. Historians still argue whether Alice's escape represents the triumph of cunning over justice or the victory of pragmatism over fanaticism. Her successful evasion of prosecution certainly saved her life and preserved her freedom, but it also left unresolved questions about her guilt or innocence that continue to fascinate scholars centuries later. What's clear is that Alice's strategic retreat demonstrates the same intelligence and foresight that characterized her business career, transforming a potentially fatal legal crisis into an opportunity for a new life beyond the reach of her enemies. You're standing in the square outside Kilkenny's cathedral as flames consume Petronilla de Meath, Alice Keitler's servant, in what will be remembered as Europe's first execution for witchcraft. The smoke rises against the grey Irish sky, carrying with it not just the life of one terrified woman, but the hopes and fears of an entire civilization grappling with questions about supernatural evil and divine justice. Petronilla's death marks a turning point in European legal history, establishing precedents that will justify the execution of tens of thousands of accused witches over the coming centuries. As you watch this tragic scene unfold, you're witnessing the birth of systematic witch persecution that will haunt the continent for the next 300 years. The decision to execute Petronilla rather than Alice reveals the cruel mathematics of medieval justice and political calculation. With Alice safely beyond the reach of Irish ecclesiastical courts, Bishop Ledred needs a visible demonstration of his authority and the Church's commitment to rooting out heresy. Petronilla, lacking Alice's wealth and political connections, becomes the perfect substitute victim. Her death serves the symbolic purposes that Alice's execution would have achieved, while avoiding the political complications that prosecuting such a powerful woman would have created. In medieval terms, Petronilla's execution represents justice served, even if it's not served on the original target. The legal proceedings leading to Petronilla's execution establish procedural precedents that will influence witch trials throughout Europe. Bishop Ledred's court follows newly developed inquisitorial procedures that emphasize confession over evidence, spiritual corruption over material proof, and the authority of church officials over traditional legal protections. Petronilla's case demonstrates how these procedures can be used to extract confessions from defendants who have little hope of mounting effective defenses, particularly when those defendants lack the social status and resources that might protect them from ecclesiastical persecution. What makes Petronilla's situation particularly tragic is her position as Alice's servant, caught between loyalty to her mistress and the demands of church authorities, who offer her only two choices: confess to participating in heretical activities or face execution as an unrepentant heretic. The pressure applied to extract her confession includes physical and psychological techniques that medieval justice considers legitimate, but that amount to torture by any reasonable standard. Petronilla's willingness to confess reflects not necessarily guilt, but the rational calculation that cooperation with authorities offers her only chance of survival, a calculation that proves tragically incorrect. The confession that seals Petronilla's fate provides Bishop Ledred with exactly the kind of detailed testimony about demonic activities that justifies her execution and validates his broader campaign against heresy. Her statements about Alice's magical practices, her own participation in supernatural rituals, and the existence of a broader conspiracy of devil worshippers serve multiple purposes beyond simply providing evidence for her trial. They establish narrative templates that will be repeated in witch trials across Europe, creating standardized expectations about what accused witches should confess and how their crimes should be understood and punished. The public nature of Petronilla's execution serves important symbolic and practical purposes in medieval societies' approach to crime and punishment. The spectacle of her death demonstrates the consequences of trafficking with demonic forces, while also providing the community with a cathartic release of the tensions and fears that Alice's case has generated. The execution also serves as a warning to others who might be tempted to engage in similar practices, establishing clear boundaries about what medieval society will and will not tolerate in terms of religious and magical activities. The method of Petronilla's execution, burning at the stake, carries specific theological significance that distinguishes her case from ordinary criminal proceedings. Fire is considered the appropriate punishment for heretics because it purifies the corruption that has infected their souls, while also preventing their bodies from contaminating the earth through burial. The flames that consume Petronilla are understood to serve both punitive and purifying functions, destroying her physical form, while theoretically offering her soul a final opportunity for redemption through suffering. The crowd that gathers to witness Petronilla's execution represents a cross-section of medieval Irish society, each group bringing its own perspectives and interests to the spectacle. Church officials see the execution as a triumph of Orthodox Christianity over heretical corruption. Anglo-Norman nobility view it as a necessary demonstration of social order and proper authority. Common people find in it both entertainment and moral instruction, a dramatic reminder of the consequences of challenging established religious and social norms. The diversity of reactions to Petronilla's death reflects the complex ways that witch trials serve different social functions simultaneously. The international attention that Petronilla's execution attracts demonstrates how Alice's case has become a matter of broader European interest. Church officials throughout the continent watch the proceedings carefully, recognizing that the precedents established in Kilkenny will influence how similar cases are handled in their own jurisdictions. The success of Bishop Ledred's prosecution encourages other ecclesiastical authorities to pursue similar cases, while the procedures he develops provide them with tested methods for investigating and prosecuting alleged witches. The documentation of Petronilla's trial and execution creates records that will serve as guides for future inquisitors throughout Europe. The detailed accounts of her confession, the evidence presented against her, and the legal procedures used to secure her conviction become part of a growing body of precedential literature that standardizes witch trial practices across different regions and legal systems. Her case demonstrates how local events can have continent-wide implications when they address fundamental questions about supernatural evil and ecclesiastical authority. Historians still argue whether Petronilla's execution represents legitimate justice against genuine supernatural corruption, or judicial murder motivated by political and social considerations that have little to do with actual guilt. The evidence suggests that she was indeed involved in practices that medieval authorities would consider heretical, but whether those practices constituted actual witchcraft or simply folk traditions that conflicted with Orthodox Christianity remains debatable. What's clear is that her death establishes precedents that will justify the execution of thousands of accused witches, many of whom will be far more obviously innocent than Petronilla appears to have been. As the flames die down and Petronilla's ashes are scattered to prevent them from being used for magical purposes, you're witnessing the end of one woman's life and the beginning of an era of systematic persecution that will haunt European women for centuries to come. Her death transforms Alice Keitler's case from a local dispute about one woman's alleged crimes into a foundational moment in the history of witch persecution, establishing legal and theological precedents that will influence European justice for generations. You're observing the moment when Alice Keitler's trial crystallizes into legal precedents that will shape European jurisprudence for centuries to come. The procedures developed during her case and the principles established through Petronilla's execution create a template for systematic witch prosecution that transforms isolated incidents of supernatural accusation into standardized legal practices. What began as one bishop's zealous pursuit of a suspected heretic evolves into a comprehensive system for identifying, prosecuting, and punishing alleged practitioners of witchcraft throughout Christian Europe. The most significant legal innovation emerging from Alice's case is the systematic application of inquisitorial procedure to witchcraft accusations. Previous supernatural cases had been handled through a combination of folk justice, ecclesiastical penance, and occasional secular punishment. But Bishop Ledred's approach demonstrates how formal legal procedures can be adapted to address crimes that exist primarily in the spiritual realm. His methods, systematic investigation, careful documentation, extraction of detailed confessions, and coordination between ecclesiastical and secular authorities become the standard approach for handling similar cases throughout Europe. The evidentiary standards established during Alice's trial prove particularly influential in later witchcraft prosecutions. The case demonstrates how physical evidence, witness testimony, and extracted confessions can be combined to build compelling cases against defendants who might otherwise be difficult to prosecute. The acceptance of spectral evidence, testimony about supernatural events that occurred in dreams or visions, opens new categories of proof that will be crucial in later witch trials where material evidence is often lacking. Alice's case shows how accusations of magical activity can be substantiated through methods that would be inadmissible in ordinary criminal proceedings. Perhaps most significantly, Alice's trial establishes the legal principle that witchcraft constitutes not just sinful behavior, but treasonous conspiracy against Christian civilization itself. This classification transforms witch prosecution from a matter of religious discipline into a question of state security, justifying the use of extraordinary legal procedures and severe punishments that would be inappropriate for lesser crimes. The precedent established in Kilkenny allows later prosecutors to argue that alleged witches are enemies of both God and state, deserving neither mercy nor the protection of normal legal safeguards. The jurisdictional questions raised by Alice's case create precedents for the relationship between ecclesiastical and secular authority in supernatural prosecutions. Bishop Ledred's successful assertion of church jurisdiction over witchcraft accusations, despite opposition from secular authorities, establishes the principle that heresy cases fall primarily under ecclesiastical law regardless of their political implications. This precedent will allow later inquisitors to pursue witch trials with minimal interference from secular courts, even when those prosecutions threaten politically powerful individuals or economically important communities. The confession procedures developed during Petronilla's interrogation become standard practice for extracting testimony from accused witches throughout Europe. The combination of physical pressure, psychological manipulation, leading questions, and promises of mercy creates a system that reliably produces the kind of detailed confessions that medieval legal theory requires for conviction in heresy cases. The specific elements that Petronilla confessed to demonic pacts, supernatural abilities, participation in Sabbaths, and conspiracy against Christian society become template confessions that will be repeated with minor variations in witch trials across the continent. The legal treatment of accomplices and associates in Alice's case establishes important precedents for expanding witch prosecutions beyond individual defendants. The principle that witchcraft involves conspiracy means that the prosecution of one alleged witch can legitimately lead to investigations of entire networks of suspects. Alice's case demonstrates how initial accusations can be leveraged to implicate broader communities of alleged heretics, creating the legal foundation for the mass witch prosecutions that will characterize later periods of intense persecution. The property confiscation procedures implemented during Alice's prosecution create financial incentives that will drive future witch trials throughout Europe. The systematic seizure of her assets and their distribution to church and secular authorities demonstrates how witch prosecutions can be profitable for those who conduct them. This precedent encourages later prosecutors to target wealthy defendants and provides them with legal justification for confiscating substantial properties under the pretext of fighting supernatural evil. The international attention that Alice's case attracts helps establish networks of communication and cooperation between witch prosecutors in different regions. Bishop Ledred's correspondence with other church officials creates information-sharing systems that allow successful prosecution techniques to spread rapidly across Europe. The precedents established in Kilkenny are studied, adapted, and implemented by inquisitors throughout the continent, creating standardized approaches to witch prosecution that transcend local legal traditions and cultural differences. The theological implications of Alice's case establish doctrinal precedents that justify systematic witch persecution on religious grounds. The trial demonstrates how accusations of magical practice can be framed as challenges to fundamental Christian beliefs about the nature of divine power and human salvation. This theological framework provides religious justification for the extraordinary measures used in witch prosecutions and helps explain why church authorities throughout Europe embrace these practices with such enthusiasm. The gender dynamics evident in Alice's case establish precedents for the disproportionate targeting of women in later witch trials. The assumption that women are more susceptible to demonic temptation, combined with suspicions about female economic independence and social autonomy, creates a framework that makes women natural suspects in witchcraft cases. Alice's prosecution demonstrates how successful women can be particularly vulnerable to supernatural accusations, establishing patterns that will be repeated throughout the European witch-hunting period. Historians still argue about whether the legal precedents established through Alice's case represent necessary developments in church law and criminal justice, or dangerous innovations that undermined traditional legal protections and enabled systematic persecution of innocent people. The evidence suggests that these precedents served the immediate needs of ecclesiastical authorities seeking to assert their jurisdiction over supernatural matters, while also creating tools that would be systematically abused in later centuries. What's clear is that Alice Keitler's trial marks a turning point in European legal history, establishing principles and procedures that will influence criminal justice throughout the medieval and early modern periods. The documentation produced during Alice's case creates a template for future witch trial records, establishing standardized formats for recording accusations, evidence, confessions, and judgments. These documentary precedents ensure that later witch trials will be conducted and recorded in ways that reinforce the legitimacy of witch prosecution, while also providing guidance for inexperienced prosecutors who need models to follow in their own jurisdictions. You're tracing the invisible threads that carry news of Alice Keitler's trial across medieval Europe, watching as a local Irish prosecution transforms into a continental phenomenon that reshapes how Christian society understands and responds to supernatural threats. The precedents established in Kilkenny don't remain confined to Ireland. They spread through church networks, legal circles, and political connections, creating a template for witch persecution that will be adapted and implemented across dozens of different legal systems and cultural contexts. What started as one bishop's zealous pursuit of a suspected heretic becomes a movement that will ultimately claim hundreds of thousands of lives. The speed with which news of Alice's case spreads throughout Europe demonstrates the sophistication of medieval communication networks, particularly those maintained by the Catholic Church. Bishop Ledred's correspondence with ecclesiastical authorities in England, France, and the papal court ensures that details of his prosecution techniques and legal innovations reach influential audiences who can implement similar approaches in their own jurisdictions. The case becomes a topic of discussion in monasteries, cathedral schools, and episcopal courts throughout Christendom, generating interest that extends far beyond its immediate legal significance. The German territories prove particularly receptive to the precedents established through Alice's trial. The fragmented political landscape of the Holy Roman Empire creates conditions similar to those in medieval Ireland: competing authorities, unclear jurisdictional boundaries, and social tensions that make witch accusations attractive tools for resolving conflicts and asserting authority. German inquisitors adapt Ledred's methods to local conditions, creating prosecution systems that will eventually make Germany the epicenter of European witch hunting during the early modern period. French ecclesiastical authorities study Alice's case with particular interest, recognizing its potential applications to their own struggles with heretical movements and political dissent. The precedents established in Kilkenny provide French inquisitors with new tools for combating Cathars, Waldensians, and other groups that challenge Orthodox Christianity. The legal procedures developed during Alice's prosecution are refined and systematized by French church lawyers, who create more sophisticated versions of Ledred's innovations that will influence inquisitorial practice throughout Catholic Europe. The spread of Alice's case precedence coincides with broader changes in European society that make systematic witch persecution increasingly attractive to authorities struggling with social and political challenges. The demographic crisis following the Black Death, the political instability caused by dynastic conflicts, and the religious uncertainties generated by papal schism create conditions that encourage the search for scapegoats and simple explanations for complex problems. Alice's trial provides a model for how supernatural accusations can be used to address these broader social anxieties. The legal innovations pioneered during Alice's prosecution find particularly fertile ground in regions where traditional authority structures are under stress. Areas experiencing economic disruption, political fragmentation, or religious conflict prove especially receptive to witch hunting as a means of reasserting control and providing explanations for otherwise inexplicable difficulties. The procedures developed in Kilkenny offer authorities throughout Europe new tools for managing social tensions and demonstrating their competence in protecting their communities from supernatural threats. The gender dynamics evident in Alice's case resonate throughout European society, where similar tensions about female independence and economic autonomy create receptive audiences for narratives about dangerous women who threaten social order through supernatural means. The precedent of prosecuting successful women as witches provides authorities throughout the continent with a model for addressing their own anxieties about changing gender roles and female challenges to traditional patriarchal authority. Alice's case demonstrates how witchcraft accusations can be used to reimpose conventional social hierarchies and punish women who step beyond prescribed boundaries. The theological implications of Alice's prosecution influence broader developments in Catholic doctrine about magic, heresy, and demonic activity. The case provides church authorities with practical examples of how supernatural corruption manifests in Christian communities and demonstrates the effectiveness of systematic prosecution in combating such threats. These theological insights are incorporated into training programs for inquisitors, legal manuals for church courts, and doctrinal statements that guide Catholic responses to similar cases throughout Europe. The international networks of scholars, lawyers, and church officials who study Alice's case create communities of expertise that standardize witch prosecution practices across different regions and legal systems. These networks facilitate the exchange of information about successful prosecution techniques, innovative legal arguments, and effective methods for extracting confessions and gathering evidence. The result is a gradual convergence of witch trial practices that transcends local variations and creates continent-wide standards for identifying and punishing supernatural criminals. The political implications of Alice's case influence how secular authorities throughout Europe view the relationship between ecclesiastical jurisdiction and state security. The precedent of allowing church courts to prosecute cases with significant political and economic implications creates models that secular rulers can adapt to their own needs. The success of Alice's prosecution demonstrates how supernatural accusations can be used to neutralize political opponents and justify extraordinary legal measures that would be difficult to implement through ordinary criminal proceedings. The economic incentives demonstrated through Alice's case, particularly the opportunities for property confiscation and the financial benefits that flow to successful prosecutors, create powerful motivations for authorities throughout Europe to pursue similar cases. The precedent of systematic asset seizure in witchcraft prosecutions establishes a funding mechanism that makes witch hunting financially self-sustaining, encouraging the expansion of persecution programs and providing resources for more sophisticated prosecution machinery. The documentary practices developed during Alice's trial create templates that standardize record-keeping and case management across different witch prosecution systems. The detailed records produced by Bishop Ledred's court become models for later prosecutors who need guidance about how to document their cases, organize their evidence, and justify their procedures to higher authorities. These documentary standards help create the paper trail that allows historians to study witch trials centuries later, while also providing contemporary authorities with bureaucratic tools for managing large-scale persecution programs. Historians still argue about the extent to which Alice's case directly influenced later developments in European witch persecution versus simply reflecting broader social and cultural changes that would have produced similar results regardless of her specific precedent. The evidence suggests that while the underlying conditions for witch hunting existed throughout medieval Europe, the specific legal and procedural innovations developed during Alice's prosecution significantly accelerated and systematized the development of persecution practices that might otherwise have evolved more slowly and less coherently. The transformation of Alice, Keitler from a local Irish merchant into a European symbol of female supernatural corruption, demonstrates how individual cases can acquire significance that extends far beyond their immediate circumstances. Her trial becomes a reference point for discussions about witchcraft, female danger, and ecclesiastical authority throughout late medieval and early modern Europe, influencing legal, theological, and popular attitudes toward women and magic for centuries after her death would have occurred under natural circumstances. You're sitting in archives and libraries across Europe and America, surrounded by scholars who have spent decades trying to understand what really happened in Kilkenny in 1324, and what it means for our understanding of medieval society, gender relations, and the origins of systematic persecution. The Alice Keitler case has generated more historical controversy than almost any other medieval witch trial, precisely because it sits at the intersection of so many different historical questions about power, belief, justice, and social change. Modern historians approach her story with analytical tools that medieval people couldn't have imagined. Yet, they still struggle to reach consensus about fundamental questions regarding her guilt, her motivations, and the broader significance of her prosecution. Feminist historians who began seriously studying Alice's case in the 1970s framed her story as an early example of patriarchal society's systematic oppression of successful women. From this perspective, Alice represents a medieval businesswoman whose intelligence, independence, and economic success threatened male-dominated power structures that used witchcraft accusations to destroy women who challenged traditional gender hierarchies. These scholars emphasize the economic motives behind her prosecution, arguing that her wealth and business acumen made her a target for men who couldn't accept female success, and who used supernatural accusations to justify their destruction of a powerful woman. Economic historians have developed more nuanced interpretations that place Alice's case within the broader context of medieval commercial development and the social tensions generated by changing economic relationships. They argue that Alice's prosecution reflects the anxieties that traditional medieval society felt about new forms of economic organization, particularly those that challenged established relationships between wealth, social status, and political power. From this perspective, her case represents not just gender conflict, but broader social resistance to economic modernization and the disruption of traditional social hierarchies. Religious historians have focused on Alice's case as a crucial moment in the development of systematic heresy prosecution and the expansion of ecclesiastical jurisdiction over supernatural matters. They argue that Bishop Ledred's approach represents the successful implementation of new inquisitorial techniques that transformed isolated incidents of supernatural accusation into standardized legal procedures for combating organized heresy. These scholars emphasize the theological innovations that Alice's case produced and its role in establishing doctrinal precedents that justified systematic witch persecution throughout Catholic Europe. Legal historians have studied Alice's trial as an early example of how medieval courts adapted existing legal procedures to address new categories of crime that didn't fit traditional frameworks for criminal prosecution. They focus on the procedural innovations that her case produced, particularly the development of evidentiary standards for supernatural crimes and the integration of ecclesiastical and secular legal authorities in complex prosecutions. From this perspective, Alice's case represents an important step in the evolution of European legal systems and their capacity to address crimes that exist primarily in the spiritual rather than material realm. Social historians have interpreted Alice's case as a window into the broader social tensions that characterized medieval Ireland and similar colonial societies throughout Europe. They argue that her prosecution reflects the complex interactions between conquest and colonization, cultural conflict, and the struggle for political control that defined Anglo-Norman Ireland. From this perspective, Alice becomes a symbol of the broader conflicts between English colonial authority, Irish traditional culture, and the Catholic Church's attempt to impose uniform religious standards across culturally diverse populations. The psychological interpretations of Alice's case have evolved significantly as historians have gained better understanding of medieval mentalities and belief systems. Earlier scholars often assumed that either Alice was genuinely practicing witchcraft, or that her accusers were cynically manipulating supernatural beliefs for political gain. More recent psychological approaches recognize that medieval people operated within belief systems that made supernatural explanations for unusual events not just plausible, but logically compelling. From this perspective, Alice's case represents a collision between different ways of understanding causation, agency, and the relationship between natural and supernatural realms. Historians still argue whether Alice was genuinely involved in practices that her contemporaries would have considered magical, or whether she was simply a successful businesswoman whose prosperity was retrospectively attributed to supernatural causes. The evidence allows for multiple interpretations. Alice may have engaged in folk healing or traditional practices that could be interpreted as magical. She may have deliberately cultivated an aura of supernatural power to enhance her business effectiveness, or she may have been entirely innocent of any practices that differed from conventional Christian devotion. Each interpretation has implications for how we understand medieval society's relationship with magic, gender, and economic power. The comparative approach to Alice's case has revealed striking similarities with other early witch trials throughout Europe, suggesting that her prosecution reflects broader patterns rather than unique local circumstances. Historians have identified similar cases from Germany, France, and Italy that feature many of the same elements: successful women accused of using supernatural means to achieve economic prosperity, ecclesiastical authorities using new legal procedures to prosecute heresy cases, and political conflicts that become entangled with religious prosecutions. These comparisons suggest that Alice's case represents an early example of continent-wide developments, rather than an isolated Irish phenomenon. Post-colonial interpretations of Alice's case have emphasized how her prosecution reflects the broader dynamics of cultural conquest and the imposition of metropolitan legal and religious standards on colonial societies. From this perspective, Alice's trial represents an attempt by English ecclesiastical authorities to assert control over Irish society by demonstrating their power to prosecute even the most successful and well-connected members of the Anglo-Norman colonial elite. Her case becomes a symbol of how colonial societies use legal and religious institutions to maintain control over potentially rebellious populations. The recent digital humanities approaches to Alice's case have used computer analysis of medieval records to trace networks of social, economic, and political relationships that may have influenced her prosecution. These studies have revealed complex patterns of alliance and conflict within medieval Irish society that suggest her case was embedded in much broader political struggles than previous historians recognized. The ability to analyze large quantities of medieval records has provided new insights into the social context that made Alice's prosecution possible, and the long-term consequences that her trial had for Irish society. The interdisciplinary approaches that combine historical, anthropological, and sociological methods have produced more sophisticated understandings of how Alice's case reflects broader patterns of social change and cultural conflict in medieval Europe. These studies emphasize how her prosecution represents a moment when different systems of authority, traditional, ecclesiastical, and secular, came into conflict and had to negotiate new relationships that would define the balance of power in medieval society for centuries to come. The continuing scholarly debate about Alice Keiteler reflects the case's significance as a historical watershed that helps us understand fundamental questions about medieval society, gender relations, religious authority, and the origins of systematic persecution. Her story continues to generate new research and fresh interpretations because it sits at the intersection of so many different historical processes that shaped the development of European civilization during one of its most transformative periods. You're standing at the threshold between medieval and modern understanding, contemplating how one woman's defiance of convention in 1324 Ireland set in motion legal, social, and cultural changes that would reverberate through European civilization for centuries to come. Alice Keiteler's story transcends its immediate historical context to become a lens through which we can examine fundamental questions about justice, power, gender, and belief that remain relevant to our contemporary world. Her case represents both a specific historical moment and and a universal human drama about the courage required to challenge established authority, and the terrible price that such challenges often exact from those brave enough to pay it. The legal legacy of Alice's case extends far beyond medieval witch trials to influence broader questions about criminal justice, evidence standards, and the relationship between religious and secular authority. The procedural innovations developed during her prosecution, particularly the systematic use of extracted confessions, the acceptance of spectral evidence, and the integration of multiple forms of testimony, established precedents that influenced European legal development for centuries. Modern legal scholars study her case not just as historical curiosity, but as an early example of how legal systems can be adapted to address new categories of crime and social conflict. The gender implications of Alice's story continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about successful women who challenge traditional power structures and face backlash that questions the legitimacy of their achievements. Her case provides historical context for understanding how societies use various mechanisms, legal, social, economic, and cultural, to control women who step beyond prescribed boundaries. The pattern of attributing female success to supernatural or illegitimate means, rather than acknowledging women's intelligence and capability, represents a persistent theme that extends from medieval witch trials to modern workplace discrimination and social media harassment. The religious dimensions of Alice's case offer insights into how faith communities balance tradition with innovation, orthodoxy with tolerance, and institutional authority with individual conscience. Her prosecution represents an early example of how religious institutions can become instruments of persecution when they prioritize institutional control over pastoral care, and when they allow political considerations to override spiritual discernment. The theological questions raised by her case about the nature of evil, the reality of supernatural power, and the Church's responsibility to protect its members from both spiritual and temporal harm remain relevant to contemporary religious communities. The economic aspects of Alice's story illuminate persistent questions about wealth, power, and social responsibility that continue to shape political and economic discourse. Her success as a medieval businesswoman who accumulated substantial wealth through intelligence, strategic thinking, and calculated risk-taking provides historical perspective on contemporary debates about successful entrepreneurs, gender equality in business, and the social obligations of wealthy individuals. The suspicion that her prosperity must have supernatural origins reflects broader social anxieties about extreme wealth accumulation that persist in modern discussions about inequality and economic justice. The political implications of Alice's case offer lessons about how authorities use legal and cultural mechanisms to maintain control over potentially threatening individuals and groups. Her prosecution demonstrates how charges of disloyalty, heresy, or other forms of social deviance can be used to neutralize political opponents and maintain existing power structures. pattern of using legal proceedings to destroy powerful individuals who challenge established authority provides historical context for understanding similar dynamics in contemporary political persecution and judicial manipulation. The cultural legacy of Alice's story extends beyond historical scholarship to influence literature, popular culture, and artistic expression throughout the centuries following her death. She has become a symbol of female resistance to patriarchal oppression, a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging established authority, and a romantic figure who represents the mysterious intersection between the natural and supernatural worlds. Her story has been retold, reimagined, and reinterpreted by countless artists, writers, and filmmakers who find in her case themes that speak to universal human experiences of courage, persecution, and survival. Educational value of Alice's case lies in its ability to illuminate multiple aspects of medieval society, while also providing insights into persistent human behaviors and social dynamics. Students who study her story gain understanding not just of medieval legal procedures, gender relations, and religious authority, but also of how historical evidence can be interpreted in multiple ways, and how our contemporary perspectives influence our understanding of past events. Her case serves as an excellent example of how individual stories can illuminate broader historical patterns, while also reminding us of the human cost of social and cultural change. The psychological dimensions of Alice's story offer insights into how individuals respond to extreme pressure, social isolation, and existential threat. Her ability to maintain her composure under investigation, execute a strategic escape, and rebuild her life in exile demonstrates remarkable resilience and psychological strength. Her case provides historical perspective on how people cope with persecution, maintain their sense of identity under attack, and find ways to survive and even thrive despite overwhelming opposition. Historians still argue about Alice's ultimate fate, whether she lived out her days in comfortable exile, whether she eventually returned to Ireland, or whether she faced further persecution in England. The uncertainty surrounding her final years adds to her mystique, while also reminding us that historical records often leave important questions unanswered. Her disappearance from historical documentation after her escape creates space for speculation and imagination that has contributed to her enduring fascination for successive generations of scholars and artists. The commemoration of Alice's story in contemporary Ireland reflects changing attitudes toward her historical significance and the broader questions that her case raises about Irish identity, colonial history, and gender equality. Modern Irish society has largely rehabilitated her reputation, viewing her as an early example of female entrepreneurship and resistance to oppressive authority rather than as a dangerous heretic who threatened social order. This reinterpretation demonstrates how societies continuously reconstruct their understanding of historical figures to serve contemporary values and political needs. As you reflect on Alice Keitler's extraordinary story, you begin to understand how individual courage and defiance can reshape entire civilizations, even when that defiance comes at tremendous personal cost. Her refusal to submit quietly to authorities who sought to destroy her established precedents for resistance that would inspire countless others throughout European history. Her case reminds us that progress often comes through the sacrifices of individuals who choose to challenge unjust systems rather than accept them passively. The shadows are lengthening now, and your journey through medieval Kilkenny draws to a peaceful close. Alice's story, with all its complexity and contradiction, settles into your consciousness like a gentle reminder that history is made by ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances and choose courage over safety. Her legacy lives on not just in legal precedents and historical scholarship, but in the eternal human struggle for justice, dignity, and the freedom to live authentic lives, despite the opposition of powerful forces that would silence or destroy those who dare to be different. Let Alice's story remind you that individual actions can have consequences that ripple through centuries, that justice is often delayed but not always denied, and that the courage to stand against overwhelming odds sometimes achieves victories that extend far beyond what those who exercise such courage could ever imagine. As you drift toward sleep, carry with you the knowledge that people like Alice Keitler have always existed, individuals who refuse to be diminished by those who fear their strength, who find ways to survive and even flourish despite persecution, and who leave legacies that inspire future generations to continue the eternal struggle for human dignity and freedom. Sleep well, knowing that her story, like all great historical narratives, continues to unfold in the choices that each of us makes when faced with our own moments of decision between courage and compliance, between justice and expedience, between standing up for what we believe and accepting what others would impose upon us. Sleep well. Good night.